Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I believe everybody else can too, or at least they should be able to.
One second, let me pause the stream so I don't
Mm-hmm.
get double sound. All right, so yes, I'm going to be answering Serato's question. And so this talk is about Geoffrey, everybody's favorite character, I swear. Disclaimer, this is not actually true. Geoffrey is not everybody's favorite character. Um, and the reason I want to talk about Geoffrey specifically is because of what Dee was talking about with the speed curve. So as Dee mentioned, the speed curve has 3 points of the triangle, right? There's the fast attacks, which win at their prescribed range or prescribed maximum range. Sometimes they're even above curve and they're extra good. There's the slow attacks, which are super slow. And then there's the mid-speed attacks, which are kind of somewhere in the middle. Oh, sorry. So my name is Andarel. I was a developer for a lot of early Exceed, and I play way too much Geoffrey, as you might find out in this section. So one thing that you'll notice, and I think we can flip briefly through Geoffrey's cards, is that there are going to be times as an Exceed player where your card speeds don't work. If, like what Dee was saying earlier, with the speed curve kind of breaking down when you are at range 1, because spike and dive don't hit, so the mid speed stop working, Geoffrey doesn't have anything faster than 4. So fast cards don't exist. There is no fast point of the speed curve. There is mid speeds and there is slows. And so what I want to talk about is what to do when your hand isn't giving you what you want to really give you a mix-up. So the thing about Geoffrey is that he is an unusual character because his card shapes are all very specific and very awkward. He has 2 projectiles, and you're going to be hearing more about the shapes of projectiles later, but suffice it to say that his projectiles are both really good. There's Golden Arrow, which is speed 4, which is pretty good at long range. As you heard, hitting at range 4 with speed 4 is on curve, and anything past that is better than curve because moves don't hit past speed 4 normally. So Golden Arrow is great. And then you have Sacrament of Blades, which is right next to it. And that card has a very similar shape. It's got, okay speed, but it's got a bunch of guard, it's got great range, and it does 3 damage and it heals you for 2. So these are projectiles. They hit at a distance and they're very effective. The rest of his cards are very much not projectiles. They don't hit a distance, but they have a lot of guard and they're kind of slow. So the question now is, what happens in a general situation? So sometimes your opponent is going to have a card that is really, really scary. There is just not much you can do about it. What are examples of this? You've played your spikes and your dives, and now the opponent has sweep, and you don't have room to cross out. You're just going to take 6 because life is terrible and sweep hits really hard. Or sometimes, you've played your sweeps and focuses, and the opponent is going to throw grasp, and you just can't stun it out. These are situations that are going to happen. You sometimes don't have an answer in your hand, and the opponent is threatening something which is really scary, and it's terrible. So the question is, how do you win, or at least how do you not lose in a situation that is basically unwinnable? So the thing first about Geoffrey, for people who aren't familiar with him, is that Geoffrey has a very, very good character ability. His character ability is quite simple. If your attack is slower than the opponent's based on printed speed, you get a free armor and a free guard. And that's great. That's less damage, you're harder to stun. But really what it's saying is your opponent's fast cards are bad. It's if the opponent wants to play a fast thing, they're going to do less. And fast cards already don't do that much in terms of damage, right? They're hitting for 3 typically on a grasp and on cross, and assault goes down from 4 to 3. So you're chunking off between a third and a quarter of their power, which is pretty good. What this means is that you're going to run into a situation where this speed curve, which is normally kind of a regular mix-up of trading and beating things at risk, starts to turn into a everybody wants to play slow stuff curve. You want to play slow stuff because that's all you have, and they want to play slow stuff because their fast things just don't hit hard enough. So what happens? How do you think about threats now? Right, your opponent's going to have cards that are scary, and the card that is scariest for Geoffrey, as you can imagine, if you're playing a slow character, is our everybody's favorite mid-speed card. You know, the classic 3-speed traditional friend, Spike. Spike does a lot of damage. Spike hits for 5, which is the second best of any card in the game. It also ignores armor, and when your whole kit is based around, armoring through trades, that's not good. So when you see a card like Spike, the question is, what do you do? And so what I'm going to be telling you, and you're going to be hearing a lot about different pieces of this throughout the game and throughout the talks later today, is that whenever your opponent is threatening something that you can't win, there's 3 things you can do. And you have to pick one of them, or else you're going to take a bunch of free damage. The first thing you can try and do is you can try and find a new option. This could mean you change cards, which involves throwing away cards from your hand to draw new cards. Specifically, you spend a bunch of force and draw a card for every force spent. As a reminder, that's going to be 1 force per card you spend, or 2 force if it's an ultra. And to talk about something that was just asked in chat, yes, Spike is basically an overhead or a guard crush move. It's one of those like slow 30 frame wind up and then smash their guard attacks, where it may have a little bit of super armor, but generally it's that like slow, awkward reaction check move in fighting games. So what you can do is you can try and find new options. Either you're digging for an EX or you're digging for something that beats Spike. And as you are Geoffrey and incredibly slow, that's usually going to be assault or dive or something like this, or maybe cross. The second thing you can try and do is you can change the situation. Changing the situation usually comes in 2 shapes. You can either move to a different distance. If you're getting threatened by Spike, which is range 2 or 3, you can not get threatened by Spike by moving to range 1, which is great. You are no longer threatened because it doesn't hit. Right? Spike, the balancing factor of Spike, other than its slowness, is that when you're threatening Spike, you're very specifically threatening range 2 and 3. For someone like Geoffrey, that just means, you have a big glowing sign saying, well, if Spike is the thing you're worried about, don't be at range 2 or 3. And the last thing you can do, and this is kind of a catch-all category, is do something weird. Every character in the game is going to have some specialized options for beating things. This might be an auto dodge somewhere, and I'll talk about Crusader's Oath later. This could be what everybody has in terms of the boosts Parry and Reading, which are going to be briefly mentioned by me and then talked about in great detail later on today. These are boosts that care about like information control. If the opponent is doing something specific, you can counter that. These are block and focuses boosts. So your 3 categories of things, like I said, or you can find an option, you can change the situation, or you can do something weird. And I'm going to go through each of those. In general, in order to win at Exceed, and every skilled player will be very good at this, a core rule of the game is figuring out what your opponent's threats are and what your threats are. Right? You're playing a character, and they're playing a character, and for the game's asymmetry to work, you need to have different and interesting threats. So yep, that's another thing you can do. You can change the situation a lot by teleporting. So let's talk again about Spike. The thing you need to know about Spike, like I said, is Spike hits range 2 to 3, speed 3, 5 damage, and if it hits hard. They probably get stunned. You, in your vast array of 7 specials, almost have absolutely nothing that beats it. If you kind of skim through his specials, you'll see there's 2 ultras that don't beat it. There's 3 range 1 to 2 things that also don't beat it. Specifically, these will both miss, and Crusader's Oath will typically trade, which is terrible. Solemn Exorcism doesn't hit, it's only range 1. Inquisition also doesn't hit, it's range 1. And lastly, he's got a range 2 special, but it's too slow. So those are all right out. Those just don't work. Sacrament of Blades might work, right? It's speed 3, so if you're attacking into Spike, then you're fine. It's because, 3 and 3 and it's too slow. But more interestingly is Golden Arrow. This is a card that has 4 speed, and so it's faster than Spike, and it does enough damage to stun Spike. So that's good. That's a good start. But the problem now is if you look at Golden Arrow, you'll note that it only hits at range 3. It'll miss entirely at range 2. So for any Geoffrey players or people playing against Geoffrey, there should be a big sign going up in your head right now saying range 2. This is a range where he can't do squat against Spike. And what this means is that he's going to like range 3, right? This is the kind of asymmetry of the game. If you have a threat, you want to make sure that you're at a range to use it, and also that you have it. Because for something like this, if he's at range 3 now, he could dive your Spike and it'll hit. He could assault your Spike and it'll hit and it's on curve. Or he could golden arrow your Spike. And if he doesn't have any of these in hand at all, that kind of sucks for him. So you can change cards. You can toss these lose to Spike things if your Spike is your priority, and get things that don't lose to Spike, because that's what you can have. The normals have a speed curve, right? They have that interaction that Dee was talking about, where slows beat fast, fast beat mid speed beat slow. There's an out. If your thing that you're being threatened by is a normal, the normals will provide you a way to beat it, even if your specials don't. So those are your answers, right? You could also say dig for EX Spike and EX Spike them back if you're very brave and want to, get some good beam value out of it and probably hit really hard and maybe block. Those are things you can do. Those are pretty good. But that's limited to the options in your deck, right? You're only going to have so many things in your deck. And as the game goes on, those options are going to get exhausted. One of your win conditions as a character like Geoffrey, where your threat values really care about a specific card, is for those cards to be used. If the opponent doesn't have Spike, then no reason to be scared of Spike. And as experienced players play, you'll note that they're going to be looking at the opponent's discard a lot. Option exhaustion is very, very important in this game. When you run out of a thing, you can't do it. And I believe Taxi is going to be talking a bunch about this when it comes to shaping a winning hand, or Jay, rather. Your endgame cares a lot about what's left as the game draws to a close. The second thing you can do, if you don't have options or you think it's going to be too risky to worry about randomness, is change the situation. Like I said, Spike only hits at 2 to 3. And what works? Well, you could not be at 2 to 3. You have, also implied threat. You have a card called Holy Wings, which is on the boost on Inviolable Judgment. This card basically says, don't be where you are. Move any number of spaces. And a lot of characters in the game would do a lot for a card that just says, be anywhere you want. Being anywhere is great. What this means is that one answer you can always do is that threat is typically going to care about locations, right? For someone like Geoffrey, you have 2 amazing projectiles. If you are at range, you're threatening the projectiles. If you're at close range, you're not. And what that means is you want to be where your hand tells you. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. If you have a lot of close range cards, you want to be close range. If you have a lot of long range cards, you want to be long range. Most characters will kind of have a theme to their kit. They'll prefer long range or they'll prefer close range. That's not really true with this guy. He's got 5 really good close range cards and 2 really good long range cards, and they are both absolutely useless outside of those ranges. So what this means is that you can do things like throw cross, forcing yourself to retreat to now threaten a long range card. That's great. That's a great tool. But if you don't have long range cards and you retreated a bunch, you now have problems. You have forced yourself into a situation where your threats just don't work. Cards like Holy Wings or like the standard move action that anybody can do let you do big repositions. The move action is, of course, expensive, right? Any character can take the move action, discarding or spending an amount of force to move that many spaces, or one more if they have to move past the opponent. Anyone can do it. If the problem that you're running into is that you're at range 4 and the opponent has an overwhelming range 4 option, which is a thing that exists. Some characters have really good range 4 options. Don't be at range 4. Spend the cards. It's going to hurt your hand size. It's going to hurt your economy. But get out of there. And now the opponent has to figure out, is that range 4 card good at not range 4? You've hurt your hand, but all the threats they were working on just start falling apart. The other way to change the situation is by boosting. Right? Every character, if nothing else in their kit, has Fierce to smash slow attacks really hard. This is the boost on Grasp, where you can boost Grasp for +2 power. And if what you think is that you really need to break through defenses, you can boost this. It also lets you, if you think that the fast part of the mix-up is not really critical, it lets you turn that into damage, which is pretty good. The evil twin of Fierce is the light boost, often known by some as the best boost in the normals within the game as far as continuous boosts go, which is +2 speed. If Spike is outspeeding everything you're going to throw at it, then go faster. You can boost light to make all your things fast, and now you're way above curve, which means that even slows start beating mid speeds. If you throw a sweep at speed 2, you bump that up to 4, it's still a slow, right? It's still going to be slower than some mid speeds on defense, and it's still definitely not fast. But hitting really hard is a great way to beat mid speeds. So those are two common ways of changing the situation. You can get out of there, at which point the value of your opponent's threats suddenly gets really wonky, and hopefully yours get better because you've moved to a space of your choice. Or you can throw boosts. Now, talking about Geoffrey, because he's the character I'm focusing on, Geoffrey has, I think without a doubt, and perhaps some other characters like maybe Turnaloose that have really bad boost problems, his continuous boosts to chain strikes are very bad, because that's just not how he works. He cares about dramatic control-y changes. So if you try and boost war him, which is the situation where one player starts throwing down a boost and the other player throws down a boost, and then player 1 goes back and puts their own boost down. You might see this, for example, when a player boosts light, so now they're 2 faster, and the other player also boosts light, and now the speed is a wash because they were both 2 faster. When you don't have many boosts to play around with, continuous boosts that increase your stats, you are going to be bad at boost wars because you can't react as easily as other characters can. Some characters, especially a lot of Season 3 characters, are good at boost wars because they have a lot of tools that will shape their strikes by utilizing a boost. And what this leads me into is the weird action. When you have boosts that change the game, that's really powerful because that is a card plus another card or plus 2 other cards. So you're building something that is stronger than your deck could ever provide, right? Your deck is going to give you something, and you're now adding stats to it. Yeah, don't boost War Geoffrey. It's terrible. So what happens with a character like Geoffrey is that sometimes, and regardless of who you are, but especially with this guy, you're going to need to do something weird, play around something that other characters can't deal with. One thing that I mentioned earlier is the Parry boost, which is on block, and Parry is very simple. What Parry says is you name a card, and if the opponent has it, they have to get rid of it. If you're worried about Spike, and you obviously can't block Spike because you're throwing Armor and Guard into a move that ignores Armor and Guard, so please don't do that. You will die. You can parry it, at which point it will be gone, right? It basically just goes away. I'm going to talk in a moment about reading, but the other two kind of special things you can do with Geoffrey are a transformation and an ultra. So now that Omni kind of segued into this in chat, I want to talk about a card that is why everybody's favorite character is not in fact Geoffrey, and is often definitely not Geoffrey. A card called Compulsive Purification. So for people who haven't really played Season 2, there's a mechanic in Season 2 called the Transformation mechanic. Your characters, if you hit with an attack, or if you discard 2 copies of the card, your character gets some kind of permanent bonus. And one of the permanent bonuses, and probably one of the best in the game, is this card, Compulsive Purification. You may spend force to cancel the opponent's boost. This is, going back to the category name, a weird action, because there's no real parallel to this. Dive's boost, Tech, which lets you discard a boost from play, is probably the closest, and is quite useful. But what this card says is you can just say no to boosts. Don't do boosts. What'll happen is if the opponent is trying to build an attack that you can't deal with, and you have this in play, you can just say no. Characters will have this in some way, right? It won't necessarily have this a specific effect, but almost anybody will have some kind of weird thing they can do. This might be like an ignore armor trick, or the ability to maybe gain stats and strike can change things rapidly. Anything that can radically change how the options interact is what I consider doing something weird, right? It just is outside your normal toolkit. Compulsive Irritation is amazing because it forces people to play a different game. So if you're relying on boosts to defeat him by building something like unbeatable, that doesn't work anymore. It now is like an economy fight. And what this means is you are dealing with their setup outside of your normal tools, which is always going to be strong. The other thing he has is a card called Crusader's Oath, which is very similar to this. It is a 2-gauge Ultra that's going to get massed over to in a second, which basically says attacks with higher speeds do not hit you. Full stop. Winners don't use fast attacks. It just doesn't work. They miss. What this means is if the opponent has boosted plus 16 speed and plus 20 power on their attack, it still misses. There's nothing they can do about it. This card costs gauge, so it's expensive. And it also doesn't do much damage. It only does 4. But this is your I win button when it comes to setups or fights, right? You're going to have situations where the threat is unbeatable, and often it's unbeatable because of speed. The faster your attack is, the less people can do about it, right? They just have to sit there and take the hit and hope to guard through it, and if it has ignore guard or ignore armor, then sucks to be them. But a thing like Crusader's Oath is doing something weird. It's going to be a threat, usually a reactive one, that is absolutely going to mess with their plans. And that's great. That's what you want in Exceed. You win the game not only by running your plans better, but by preventing the opponent from doing what they want. This could be being at the wrong range. This could be having something really awkward. And the answer to that is, if your speed is 3, does Oath cause it to whiff? So no. If your speed is 3, it is not a higher speed attack. And what this means is if you attack into Oath with Spike, 3 is not greater than 3, Spike still hits, Geoffrey is sad and gets stunned, and once more things lose to Spike. So it's going to be a bad time. So yeah, do something weird. You have ways. These are how you beat a thing that is unbeatable, right? It's going to be some kind of trump card option or bizarre option that is absolutely going to win. And if you're playing against him or playing against whoever other character, one of the most important things that you need to do when you want to try and win the game is keep very good track of what their threats are. If you are trying to build a setup, look out for something like Crusader's Oath. Know it exists. Respect it, because you don't want to lose 3 cards worth of boosts by getting blanked by Crusader's Oath. It's not going to kill you. It's only 4 damage. But you might lose a lot of resources throwing an Ultra into this and getting blown out. The similar card that every single character has, and that I was asked to kind of run through the details on, is the boost on focus. So you're going to be hearing a lot about this card. This card is called Reading. It is probably the most infamous boost in the entire game of Exceed, because when Reading wins, it wins. Capital W. What this says is name a normal attack and strike. You pick the name of a normal attack that you hope is in the opponent's hand, and then you attack the opponent. You put your card down. They have to do one of 2 things. If they don't have the card you named, they show you their hand, which is great because it gives you a lot of information. If you know what's in their hand, you know what you have to respect. The mix-ups don't work if the opponent knows what you got, right? You might not have any slows, and then they just play it fast, and you're good, and they're good. But even worse, if you do have the card, you have to play it. This could mean you're at range 3, and the opponent named Grasp, and now not only does Sweep beat Grasp, you miss, and you're down a fast attack. Or Geoffrey might say, well, I named Spike, and then I assault in, and now you're down a Spike, and I hit you and deal free damage. Reading definitely qualifies as do something weird, because it's fighting on a dimension that everything else doesn't. All Reading cares about is, do you know what's in the opponent's hand? And there's a couple ways you could do this. One, as the game goes on, people will naturally just have more cards known, right? You'll have a lot of cards in your discard. You'll know what's there. If you let your deck run out, and so you're going to reshuffle automatically, they can figure out what's in your hand just by looking at what's not. At which point, they know what's in your hand. You might just get red and take a bunch of damage for free. Also, there are situations where you might miss with a boost like Parry or Reading, that you name a card that's not in their hand, whether it's intentional, with Parry, for example, or accidental. If that happens, now they know your hand, and you might get red. This is very powerful, right? This boost is almost certainly the strongest boost in the game. And what this means is that your opponent absolutely has to respect information and knowledge. If you're trying to do something obvious, there's going to be an answer to it. And one thing that answer is saying is don't play your focus. So the more you hold on to these things to do that, the better fast attacks get, right? If you're not playing slows, because slows have amazing boosts, specifically Parry, Reading, and Light, fast attacks get a little better. And that makes the game more aggressive and more interesting because you start having to take risks. You start having to figure out when the opponent is trying to go on curve and play around it. And what that means is there's always going to be an answer. No matter how strong the opponent's threat is, you can find a better threat of your own, which might be an EX, because EX attacks are great. You can boost or move to change the situation enough that your attacks are just straight up better because their things stop working or the stats change. Or you can play a card that fights in a different way entirely. You might be able to cancel their boost, find an auto dodge, or use the knowledge control on these regular boosts and some character-specific things to either delete the threat from their hand or force them to play something that you now have seen them do and get rid of that threat entirely. Reading, which is going to, like I said, be talked about more later, only works on normals. So if what you're threatening is a special, well, they're not going to be able to reading it. And if the opponent knows you have normals, you might want to get rid of those and change cards, at which point they go away, and you get a whole new set of cards, which A, could be better, and B, are new, not known. So yeah, Geoffrey, like I said, is a weird character because he's slow. Right, fast attacks don't really work because you have free armor tanking through their defense. And slow attacks are great. What's going to happen on a character like this is he wants to play a game where the only mix-up people care about is slow versus mid-speed. That's how he changes the game. If you run out of fast attacks, or even more importantly, if you run out of mid-speeds, that might be a win condition. That's how your character wants to win, is making the opponent run out of these scary mid-speed options. Your game plan is something that you need to think about regardless of who you're playing. And very importantly, it's something that all of your moves, at least a little bit, should work towards. If you get hit by cross, that might be fine. You might accept the 3 damage that there's not much you can do about in exchange for better positioning at range 4 or range 5, if your character likes that more, by threatening something like sweep to force them to cross out. That's something that is disrupting your opponent's hand by forcing them into making awkward plays. You might be in a situation, if you're someone like Geoffrey, where you don't really care about their fast mix-up, and you are accepting getting hit by Spike, and you just throw something and eat the 5 damage, then try and win the next couple strikes. That's up to you. That's how you want to win, is your own personal preference. But you're basically always going to do it by making your hand pull as much work as possible, which usually means making your opponent scared of what you've got. And if something is not useful, either make it useful by moving or boosting, or get rid of it and get something new. Sometimes, for example, it might be too expensive to move a lot. If you're at range 6, digging for a projectile is probably cheaper than throwing away your whole hand to move to range 1, especially if the opponent doesn't want, or especially if the opponent wants to be at range 1 more than you do. Because you're losing some cards to find new cards, but they might be spending a lot to move to that range. And again, it's up to you. how you make your cards do the most work is something that's going to be a personal choice and something that's going to be your own, path to victory. But the thing you should always be thinking about is there is no perfect hand. A hand will basically never be completely invincible unless your character is ridiculous and probably got banned at some point in season 1. Everything is about where things are amazing and how to make things do their best work. And what that could be, like I said, finding new things, changing the context, or finding some way to interact on a different angle. So yeah, any questions or other things that people want more info on? So chat's talking a little bit about the BHG character, which is an acronym for Big Hand Guile. It's a line of play where your goal is to get as many cards into your hand at once using Guile's Exceed UA. But yes, you have a lot of things. Those things are great. Those things also open you up to this thing called reading, which I talked a little bit about. And also, when you're playing a lot of EXs, you're running out your options quickly. You're going to not have those cards anymore. One side thing about Guile is that, similar to Geoffrey, his cards all look kind of samey. So yeah, EX Focus. EX Focus is really interesting because EX Focus doesn't really benefit all that much from the extra defensive stat. Most EXs, you're playing either for the +1 speed, and +1 speed on 1 is really going to do basically nothing, or the +1 armor and guard. And Focus already has so much armor and guard that it doesn't really need the extra +1/+1. If you really need to hit 8 guard effectively, right, 3+6 for the EX instead of 2+5, then by all means play it. But typically, no. Focus doesn't really benefit from the reasons you would play EXs, which, like I mentioned, are breaking the speed curve to go faster, which slow attacks don't really help us much for, or getting extra effective armor and guard, which Focus doesn't really want. Also, the boost on Focus and the card itself are both so good at what they do, which is defensive counter hitting, that you're unlikely to really need that opportunity cost, right? When you play an EX, you don't have that card anymore, right? You've used both copies, unless you're a weird character that can play EXs more easily, which some characters can do. The EX has the very high cost. If you play an EX mid-speed to make it faster, for example, you now no longer can threaten that mid-speed, which makes slow attacks better. There's probably going to be more talk about this later today, but one concern about perfect hands, that if those perfect hands are very EX reliant, they're great early while you can drop those EXs and get stuff that's hard to contest. But as the game goes on, when you get further into your deck, the opponent has way fewer things that they have to play around because you've run out your own options very quickly. So that's the risk you take. And EX Focus, that is probably the worst use of that risk, if that makes sense. The main use of it might be to beat an ignore guard 3 power attack, which does exist. Because that third point of power gets armored and everything is great. You hit back for 5. But you're paying a lot. You're dropping both your readings, and Focus is a good card. It's got 6 effective power because it hits for 4 and it's got 2 armor, and it draws you a card, even if it misses. So, yeah, that's a lot of value.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andarel.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see. I've notified our next folks. We've got about 6 minutes until the next section goes.
So Iaquis, just while we wait for the next person, Iaquis likes EXs because, remember what I mentioned earlier about EXs trading options later for reliability now? Iaquis, his reliability is kind of awkward, right? He wants to play cards face up, which means that if the opponent has a way they can win, then they're going to win. But EXs, there's less ways to win. So EX, for example, EX Dragonheart, right? It's a speed 7, range 1 attack, so it's on curve, and it hits really hard. It's 10 damage. D's going to pull it up. But yes, if you have a character that really, really wants to Yep. So if you think about this with +1 to all its stats, 1, 8, 7, and then 1 armor, 1 guard, but who cares? 187 is 110-7 when he plays it face up because of his ability, which is if you play your card on offense face up instead of face down, you have +2 power. So you hit really hard in exchange for letting them deal with it however they want. EXs are harder to deal with. So, yes, that's why characters might like EXs. If they really, really need things to be reliable, and who cares about not having that later? Is there a character who has an ability related to EXs? Yes, there's a couple. In Season 2, Remulus is probably the most notable example. She has the ability to make EXs easier and power them up. In Season 1, there's a character called Kaden. In Season 2, there's also some characters that have smaller abilities that improve your EXs. So, for example, Carl from the Nier Automata or Penny Arcade Automata, he's a one-off character. Yeah, so Remulus, she can make your attacks EX more easily. Obviously, this is really good because EXs. What I said earlier about EXs reducing your options, that doesn't apply now if you're just using one card and you still have the other copy. And then her Exceed mode makes your EXs extra EX and scary. Some characters may have easier EXs, so King Knight and Minato can EX more easily. Carl can EX more easily. But the only character I believe in seasons 2 through 4 that has a UA that specifically cares about improving your EXs is Remulus. Doesn't mean more won't be printed. Pretty sure they will be. Yeah, it's really expensive. Paying 3/4 to EX is a very high cost, and that's the offset that you gain when you realize that EXs, one, break the speed curve automatically without needing to take actions to boost or do weird things, and two, you're EXing, you would already have to spend a card, so you don't have to spend the card for EXing. And if you EX Spike, for example, against Geoffrey, you'll still have your other copy of Spike. So you're paying a lot, but you're both keeping your options open for later in the game, which is super good, and you're not reliant on drawing 2 copies of the thing. So, yeah, more flexibility now and way more flexibility later. So, yeah. EXing. It's a really good tool. I think you'll hear more about it later. Basically, a lot of characters are going to have this kind of trade-off. If something is very reliable, it's going to be expensive. You may see super strong ultras or super strong boosts that cost something, but when you do it, you're paying a lot. Yeah, Imogen, I think, has a way to improve her EXs. So does Eugenia. So does...
Imogen does not directly.
Really?
Eugenia does. No. Yeah, Imogen improves her wild swings and also gains stats when the opponent wild swings.
Okay, that's something.
It's nice.
Okay, so 7th class characters all cost a ton to exceed, but part of that is because there's the mechanic that I really briefly mentioned called transformations, where your cards get more powerful as you hit with them. And if you look underneath the exceed number, you'll see a little circle snake eating its own tail -2. Every transformation, which are the cards with that symbol, reduce your exceed cost by 2. So they start off with a very difficult exceed, and as the game goes on, they might exceed for somewhere between 0 and 2 gauge once they start getting some transformations down. This kind of leads to a gameplay flow where you're incentivized to flip later on and not incentivized to flip early. You shouldn't rush for your exceed. And part of the reason for this is that their exceeds are very different from their unflipped side. Whereas Street Fighter exceeds are more powerful. It definitely can cost 0, yes. Street Fighter exceeds, for example, are more powerful versions of the regular exceed, and they might give you some kind of kicker effect when they exceed, right? You might move and draw cards when you exceed. But 7th Cross exceeds, which might also do that, tend to be very different. They, if you look at Remulus, who we just had pulled up, her unflipped side lets you EX more easily. But her flipped side So her unflipped side lets you get EXs more easily, while her unflipped side makes your EXs way more powerful. It resolves all of the triggered abilities, so before, hit, and after, 3 times. Assault closes 6 and gains triple advantage, which is the same as regular advantage. Cross retreats 9. Sweep discards 3 cards at random from their hand, and then they cry. Grasp lets you move them to basically any space on the board. Right, your EXs are fantastic, but it's much harder to use it because, you don't have your EX anymore. You might have ground 0, which means that if you hit with ground 0, you gain +3 power 3 times, and the opponent is deleted off the face of the map because they just took 14. Don't get hit by range 1, Yellow Death, ground 0, you will die. The game is probably over. So 7th cross exceeds tend to work like this. Their exceed mode is like the big, flashy, scary effect, and the unflipped mode is like a very utilitarian, kind of toolkit-y, versatile effect. One of these might be better, one of these might be worse, but that's often up to you. A lot of the time you can make both of these work in some way, or you'll want to flip when the situation calls for it. So that's why, going back to your earlier question, their exceeds are a little situational, but they get cheaper as they go because you're kind of intended to work your way up into them, as opposed to it just being a raid or rush for power. And going back to that perfect hand, right? There is no perfect hand. You don't always have the exceed mode that you really, really want. You need to make the best of what you have, and you want to try and make what you have as the best it can be. So with that, I think I will cede the floor to the next speaker, and hope everyone learned something.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.